Well, he's a former atheist, a seasoned cold case detective, and popular national speaker, and he tackles his most important case with you on the jury. With the expertise of a cold case detective, J.Warner Wallace examines 8 critical pieces of evidence in the crime scene of the universe to determine if they point to a divine intruder. If you've ever wondered if something or someone outside the natural realm created the universe and everything in it, well, this is the case for you. He joins us in a moment to talk about his latest book, God's Crime Scene. But here he is in the new feature film, God's Not Dead 2.
What's an unintended eyewitness support statement?
If I can borrow your Bible. Let me go to the Gospel of Matthew for an example of this. I'll start with a passage in which Jesus is in front of Caiaphas at a hearing. It says here, "Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, 'Prophesy to us, Christ, who hit you?'" Now that seems like a very simple request, given that the people who hit him are standing right in front of him. This makes no sense. Why would it be prophecy to be able to tell you who hit you? But Luke mentions something that Matthew omits. He says, "The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, 'Prophesy, who hit you?'" So now we know why this was a challenge, because Luke tells us the thing that Matthew left out, that he was actually blindfolded at the time this took place. This is very common, this kind of unintentional eyewitness support that fills in a detail that the first witness left out. And after years of scrutinizing these Gospels, using the template that I use to determine if an eyewitness is reliable, I concluded that the 4 Gospels in this book contain the reliable accounts of the actual words of Jesus.
Wow, we encourage you to go out and make sure you support by watching that film. Jay, it's so great to have you here in the studio
Really
with
good
us.
to be, and good to meet you finally. So I'm so glad.
Yeah,
to be here.
you too. Thank you so much for coming in today to talk to us about this incredibly important topic. You know, the creation of the universe, the origins of life.
Right.
These things kind of matter, don't you think?
Yeah, and so for me, I was the kind of guy who was looking at the Gospels, and I was stuck as an atheist. I thought that they were reliable, given some of the evidence we even talk about in God's Not Dead 2. But I rejected the supernatural claims of the miracles. I would have said this is some form of historical fiction. And that was because I was a very committed philosophical naturalist. I was the kind of guy who would have said, well, I reject miracles, I reject anything supernatural. So that's when the next part of the investigation for me as an atheist was, does my philosophical naturalism really explain the universe the way it truly is? Or have I been missing something?
Okay.
So that's when I went back and looked at the evidence in the universe and asked the question, can you explain this from staying inside the room of the natural universe, or is the better explanation outside the realm of naturalism? And if that's the case, it's always the same thing we do in crime scenes, right? We're looking at evidence for an intruder.
Okay, we're going to get into that because you bring all these years of expertise as an officer, as a criminal investigator, into the whole conversation about origins of the universe, and it's a brilliant way to look at things. But I want to ask you, how do you go from being a committed atheist to having a role in a movie called God's Not Dead, Part 2. Yeah. How does that happen, Jay?
Well, part of it was just that my wife was more interested in going back to church. You know, she was raised kind of as cultural in the church, but really had no idea what Christianity taught. We didn't have a Bible in the house, and for the 18 years we had been together at that point, she knew better than to bring this up around me because I was just not interested. And I would have gone as an atheist. My dad's been doing that his entire life, and I would have been happy to do it too. And that's how I ended up in a evangelical church at the age of 35. Really, I'd never been in such a church except for like a funeral or maybe a wedding. But that was it. And I was willing to go. And the pastor on that day pitched Jesus in a way that I could catch him. Wow. He just pitched him as a really smart guy whose teaching has been so foundational to Western civilization. You ought to listen to what it is Jesus had to say. So I bought a Bible really for the only purpose is to mine out the clever kind of proverbial statements of Jesus. But I ended up seeing things in the accounts of the Gospels that bugged me because they resembled the kinds of eyewitness statements. I typically work in cold cases that are really slightly different versions of the same event that puzzle together nicely. And that's what I see in all my cases. No witnesses ever agree on anything precisely. So you have to kind of be able to puzzle. And I was doing that with the Gospels, and I got interested, and that's what led me to ask the question, is my philosophical naturalism, my idea that everything can be explained by using nothing more than space, time, matter, the laws of physics and chemistry, I would have said that that's all you need to explain anything in our experience, anything in our environment. Was that actually true? Or are there some questions that I actually had kind of a secular faith, an atheistic faith about. I trusted in things that I could not demonstrate evidentially. And that's really where I found myself. Yeah, that's a matter of faith.
You know, that's so interesting because a lot of naysayers, a lot of atheists, those who are against, the Bible and creation by, intelligent design, they would say that the Bible is kind of a dumb book, and it's for people who aren't sharp and all this. But here you are, a detective, and the opposite attracted you. It was the intellectualism of Jesus that attracted you. That's a first for me.
A lot of what he talked about is so countercultural and counterintuitive, right? This idea of loving those who hate you, of turning the other cheek, the kinds of things that I would have said as an atheist were provocative. And even as an atheist, I would have said these are high values that I would want for my kids to embrace, that I would want my culture to embrace, but what are they really grounded in? Could my atheism get me there? And I would have said that yes, I think that non-believers can live very moral lives. I would have said I was living, of course, I'm the judge of that, right, as an atheist. But the question is, can you ground what you believe is a high moral value on the basis of just your philosophical naturalism? Or is the better explanation for these high values something that is divine, that is a personal source of all morality? Because if you think about it, Joe, our moral obligations are just that. They're moral obligations. And I am not morally obligated to my police car, but I am morally obligated to my partner. I'm not morally obligated to the laws of physics. If physics is where we get our moral obligations, no, it turns out if there are such things as transcendent, objective moral obligations that transcend every culture, that we don't make them, we just recognize them. They transcend every point in history. Even if there's a Star Trek universe, okay, these moral obligations apply not just to humans, but to Klingons and Romulans, okay? So the point is there's some source for this that transcends culture and even transcends species. Well, what could that be if you know it has to be a personal source because we're not morally obligated to impersonal things like cars and buildings. We're morally obligated to persons. So the question for me became, well, what could this transcendent, objective, moral person be to whom I'm obligated? And so how do I ground the sense that I have that there are some things that I don't, they were true before I was even around to recognize them. They belong in the universe in a different way than my personal opinion.
Okay. Well, I got to say, man, I love the way you think. You think outside the box. God has given you a really unique way to look at things. And I really enjoyed how you interjected personal stories of your policing career into the book. Now, for those who haven't read it, I want you to explain, how did you take what you learned in policing and how did you use that to go about looking at God's crime scene to see who the intruder was?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do at death scenes is we're trying to figure out, is this death scene a crime scene? Not every way that you die is criminal. As a matter of fact, 3 of the 4 ways you die are not criminal. Accidental suicides and natural deaths we don't investigate. We only investigate criminal deaths, murders. So when we get in the room, the first thing we got to figure out is this a criminal death? Is it the 4th category? And how you determine that is, if I can explain everything that's in the room by staying in the room, it's not going to be a murder, most likely.
Okay.
So if I get there and there's a dead body and there's a pistol, but the pistol happens to belong to the guy, it's always been in the room to begin with, it started off in the room, there's a suicide note that came on the stationery that started off in the room, and he's the writer of the note. Well, now I can explain everything in the room by staying in the room. It's not going to be a murder.
Okay.
On the other hand, if that pistol's not his, and that DNA on the note is not his, it's not his stationery, it's not in his handwriting, and there's even bloody footprints leading out of the room, well, now clearly the best explanation for the stuff in the room is a source outside the room. So now I've shifted everything to murder because I've got evidence of an intruder. So the inside or outside the room game is very helpful for us when we're trying to figure out, is it a death scene or a crime scene? So I said, couldn't we apply the same template to the universe?
Yeah, bring that
8 pieces of evidence in the room of the universe. The only question is, can I explain these 8 pieces by staying inside the room? If I can't explain them by staying inside the room, now I've got something that transcends the universe, that is external to naturalism, right? When I say naturalism, I mean it cannot be explained by purely space, time, matter, and the laws that govern space, time, and matter, physics and chemistry. So now I've got to use something, a source, that's outside the room of the natural universe.
Yeah.
And so you can take the same crime scene tools and processes you use at a physical crime scene. Could we apply that thinking to the physical universe, and what does it tell us?
Okay.
What's the better explanation? And I think for these 8 pieces of evidence, actually the best explanation is something outside the room that is the source for everything inside the room. And when that happens, and that's why when I, at some point as an investigator of this, I got to the end of the Gospels and I was like, I'm almost there, but I don't trust the resurrection account. I don't trust the miracle accounts. But then when I realized that if there's a being that could account for everything in the universe, all science demonstrates that space, time, and matter and these laws come from nothing. And if that's true, then that is the most amazing miracle that this being could ever perform. It's in Genesis 1, right? It's in the beginning, God creates. Well, if there's a being like that could blink into existence everything we call the natural universe, I bet you that being has the power to walk on water. So it shifted my thinking about all the miracle accounts in the Gospels. These didn't become obstacles I couldn't move past, because I realized if there's a being that could do that, he could probably do this.
Wow. You know, if there's somebody watching today, Jay, who's highly intellectual, who is looking for evidence, what would you say to somebody who's searching today? What would be your advice for them?
Well, I think for me, a lot of it is being really careful about your presuppositions, right? And so for example, the evidence doesn't, I typically say that science doesn't say anything, scientists do. Ooh. The evidence doesn't say anything. It's the evaluator of evidence, the jury, that gets to say what the best inference is.
Wow.
And if you're not careful, your presuppositions coming in color the way you see the science or you see the evidence. So when I make a case in the book like this, I'm using the exact same evidence that my atheist friends, or I would have used as an atheist before, to make a case. This is also true in criminal trials. I'll spend 6 weeks, we'll present all the evidence to the jury. The defense team comes in, they don't call a single piece of new evidence. They just want the jury to reinterpret, using different set of experts, the evidence we've already presented. So it turns out the evidence doesn't say anything. You get to infer properly. So if you're examining this for the first time, from an atheistic perspective, just ask yourself the question, are you being fair? Or are you allowing your naturalism, the idea that before I even investigate whether or not something supernatural could exist, I start off with a bias against the supernatural? That's not fair. I couldn't do that in a criminal investigation. I have to leave everything open until I arrive at the right suspect. So I would just ask people who are investigating, are you being fair? Or have you allowed your bias against the supernatural to eliminate that explanation before you even begin? If that's the case, don't be surprised that you'll always come back to your conclusions, because it turns out those weren't your conclusions, those were your starting points. You just never moved. And that's the question, are we willing to move from our starting points?
Jay, you gotta promise me you'll come back.
Oh, I'd love to do it.
Because I don't know if they can see this at home, I got to page 1 of page 12 of my questions for you. I literally asked the first highlighted question. We have so much more that I'd love to cover with you. And for those of you who are watching at home, please, can I encourage you to make sure you get a copy of this book, God's Crime Scene. I got about halfway through it, and I had to stop and go back again, because it's filled with so much evidence that will just blow your mind to show that there is a designer in this universe, and he's the God of the Bible. Jay, thank you so much for coming, and you will come back, right?
I'd love to come back. Thanks for having me, Joe. I appreciate it.
All right, awesome.